Good evening. Today is Tuesday, January 18th. I'd like to welcome everyone to this month's edition of our Morgan City Planning Commission meeting. I'd also like to welcome those who are joining us via technology. It looks like we've got a few that are logged into the Zoom meeting, so welcome to you as well. If there's a point where your participation is required, if you'll please unmute, but keep yourself muted until that time comes, and then raise your hand or let us know somehow that you have something to say. That being said, we did not meet in December. Our last meeting was in November. We have our minutes to approve from October 19th meeting. And at this time, I'll entertain a motion to approve those minutes for those who have had an opportunity to review them.
Does it make a difference whether I'm excused or not?
It should not make a difference unless you're materially changing the content. If you're just correcting some typos, then yeah, that'd be fine.
Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes of October 19th, 2021.
Thank you, Lance. Do we have a second? Thanks, Jim. Let's vote on approving the minutes. All in favor? That is unanimous. We have 3 agenda items tonight. Our first agenda item will be to discuss the Rupp subdivision. Commission member Dan Dixon has previously spoken with me and asked to be recused for this portion of the meeting. So we'll excuse him until we've accomplished this agenda item. Then we'll bring him back in for the remaining 2 agenda items. Thank you, Dan. With the Rupp subdivision back in September, we had, let me just scroll down here. I'm going soft copy instead of hard copy today. All right, this is a 11.25 acre project that came before us back in September for a couple of reasons. One is we needed to change potentially some of the zoning general plan considerations, but also the concept plan. This approval was granted for the concept plan back on September 21st. And tonight we do have a representative from the project that can share a little bit of background with us and what they're seeking tonight, and maybe walk us through the new plats that we have as a commission in our packets. So this time, Ben Russell is with us. Ben, I'll turn the time over to you just to share a little bit more about the project.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is just the next step, just a continuation on what was started, what was referenced there earlier. Everything is the same as far as the plat goes. It's just been more engineering has been done and reviewed and those sorts of things. I assume that everyone has got a copy of the comments from the planner and the engineer, and of course we have as well. What we're seeking tonight is pre-plat approval, contingent on the resolution of those comments and stuff. And so that's what we're seeking. But it looked like from the comments that we received, everything's pretty straightforward, pretty easily resolved. We're in the process right now of completing the geotech report, which is one of the requirements, of course, and that'll help us wrap up some of the engineering as far as road profiles and water tables and all those sorts of things. And so that should be completed in the next few weeks. And then we are meeting with the Water Advisory Board next week. And so we should know where we stand there, but thinking that should be straightforward as well. The rest of it, we have a couple questions on a couple of the comments, just wanting maybe to get them a little better defined and stuff. That don't disagree with anything that was suggested or asked of us there or anything. Just maybe need a little clarification on a couple of them, but everything, like I say, everything seems pretty straightforward, and at least from our perspective, and we have most of them resolved right now. So just kind of waiting to wrap up those other two outstanding things.
So thank you for that. Let me just open it up to the commission. There's a comment that I wanted to address, and that's one of the staff comments. It sounds like all the open items are understood and being worked on actively. So that's the good news. Typically, as a recommending body to the city council, we have tried to be as disciplined as we could to send over projects that are buttoned up. And this one has a few buttons that are not done up at this point. And so we want to, understand as a commission, do we move forward with some of the conditions, assuming we do want to move forward with some of the conditions that staff had recommended, or table this particular agenda item until all of the noted outstanding items have been completed. So that's one thing that I wanted to address before we spend too much time on it. And if we determine that we want to move forward with some of these conditions set, then we can have that part of the discussion as well.
Mr. Chair. The first one will obviously be the water board meeting on the 25th of January. Obviously, we don't know the results or the outcome of that meeting. I guess the question would also be the lot 6 and 7. Have those been adjusted yet, or is that to be adjusted?
Yeah, they've been adjusted. I mean, it was inches, or it's.
I guess I'm just trying to ascertain what hasn't been completed yet.
Well, really, the only thing that hasn't been, and I'm not seeking approval. I'm just seeking approval just conditionally to these being resolved, just to be clear there. But the only thing that hasn't been completed obviously is the Water Advisory Board meeting. That hasn't taken place. And then the completion of the geotech report. Right. But as far as changing, material type or adjusting lot lines or, things of that nature, that's all been done.
What are the implications of those two outstanding items? Let's say the geotechnical report comes back and the water table is unexpectedly high. What does that mean for the project?
I think worst case scenario, if you had a water table condition there, and really I'd expect one to a certain degree is you just wouldn't have basements. But outside of that, so I think that would be worst case. And but I don't think you would expect anything different. It's surrounded by homes. It's 11 acres and kind of on an island there in a way. And so I don't expect anything too extreme. You know what I mean? So, okay.
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Well, go ahead.
And I may have missed this in reviewing the material, but this being preliminary approval, is this in a sensitive lands area?
No.
So if it's preliminary approval, the commission could still grant that conditionally. It's the final approval that everything would need to be done before it went to city council. So the city council would not review this preliminary approval unless I missed something.
This is a preliminary approval. So you're exactly right, Steve. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, and that would be, I mean, hey, I'd love it if you'd prove it, irregardless of the comments, but I am just seeking a conditional approval just based on those being resolved.
And with the water board meeting on the 25th, what would be the implications one way or another with that outcome?
Well, you got to have water, you know, you've got to have X number of shares for X number of acres and you have to meet the requirements as far as that, you know, that's probably the most fundamental requirement. We think we have that in place and then just address, you know, if there's existing ditches or things like that that are on the property that need to be piped or somehow, you know, addressed in some way. Would probably be the two biggest things, you know, that I could think of. So,
Mr. London.
So from a city council standpoint, a little background on this. This was a fairly controversial piece of property. A lot of the property owners nearby wanted half-acre, full-acre lots. It could have been anything, you know, it could have been a 10,000 square foot lot. But as a city council, we voted and we wanted a minimum, we wanted to make it an R112, a 12,000 square foot lot. Lot 4. .20 is not 12,000 square feet. Or am I not reading that correctly?
you're not reading it correctly.
Okay, fine. That's fine.
It's 0.28. It's
Okay.
It's just over 12,000 square.
Okay, all right, okay. And I thought it looked like 2.0, so. Okay, so all of the lots are over the 12,000 square foot. Is that correct, Ben? Okay. All right. Sorry, my bad. I didn't have my glasses on.
Hey, that's pretty small font. I have a magnifying glass on my desk. So.
Thank you. Well, the Water Advisory Board is next Tuesday. The Water Advisory Board is next Tuesday. Of course, that Water Advisory Board was put in place to make sure that before any development moved forward, that everything was taken care of as far as the city water was concerned, the secondary water was concerned, and the local ditch company, as far as they were concerned, that everyone was on board with that. So, yeah, that meeting is, of course, not been held yet. So that's kind of a prerequisite to moving forward, is that everybody's on board with that on the Water Advisory Board. So, yeah. Which came about, by the way, because of some heartache years ago when things were approved and some of these things had not been cleared through the ditch companies and particularly the ditch company. So that was why the Water Advisory Board was put into place and created. So it's a good thing.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
And the wording in here, requirement should, and living with my wife, the legal scholar over there, the wording, if it was an absolute requirement, would say shall be. And then in number 2, it says this should be determined. So, you know, I'm with the understanding if we put the requirements that these things are done prior, I think we'd be okay.
Okay. Lance, you had a comment?
Do you have a date or time that you think the geotech report may be done?
Ben, that was
Ben,
addressed.
do you,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
I'm sorry, sir.
do you have a time? When are you expecting the geotech report to be done?
Probably 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that.
Okay, thanks.
I'm hoping for sooner, but you know how it goes. Just, within the next month for sure, but.
And then Jay, I thought I saw your hand. No? All right, just bad vision here too. All right, well, I think let's continue discussing this. I'm not hearing any rumblings that there's a motion to table this, but.
If I may, I know it's not a big deal. We could probably approve it with conditions, and they're probably going to be 3 weeks to a month before they have that final the geotech report done. I could definitely see, depending on the results of that geotech report, there could possibly be some changes to this plat. And that being said, if I may, I don't really see it holding up construction or anything. I don't see anything wrong with it. I definitely see this as something that's going to happen and has worked into be a good fit for this area. And I appreciate CenterPoint's willingness to work with us on changes that we've asked for, but I have a hard time and don't want to get in the habit of approving things with conditions, especially in this case. I don't think it's going to hold anything up. So that being said, if I may, I'd make a motion to table the preliminary plat for the Rups subdivision located approximately 500 north, 400 west until a later date.
Okay, we have a motion on the table. Is there a second for this motion? All right.
I'll second.
Thanks, Jim. We've got a second on the motion. Any discussion before we vote?
I disagree with Lance. We don't want to set a precedence, so.
Thank you. Any other discussion?
I just kind of feel the same way. Like I felt like if there was some urgency to do something, then we maybe would try to do something conditional so you could sneak in and get something done early before our next meeting, but it just doesn't feel like there's any pressure there or any benefit really. So I kind of just go with the flow. If you were to suggest the other, I would probably be okay with passing it. I'm indifferent on tabling or conditional. So if you were to recommend conditional, I'd probably support that too. So.
Let me ask him, what's this going to do to the project, if I can ask?
I mean, it doesn't do much to the project. I think, I guess from my perspective, there's no risk from the commission's point of view if it was approved, because it's approved on a specific set of parameters that your consultants have already put forward. And so from my perspective, that you're not really at risk, and it still feels like we're advancing the project through the approval process. And we have a defined checklist that we're working from and stuff. But as far as delaying the project substantially or anything like that, it doesn't affect us.
Any other comments before we vote? Just to restate, the motion is to table this preliminary approval conversation until a later date when these outstanding conditions have been met. All in favor of the motion as outlined? All opposed? 4-1, motion passes. We will table this conversation in accordance with Lance's motion.
Mr. Chair, if I could make a comment.
You may.
Thank you. Just to let the applicant know that it's not uncommon that if everything is in order and ready to go, that both preliminary and final could be heard at the same time. Again, if everything were done.
Yeah, that's great to know too. So, yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. We have 2 more agenda items for tonight, but before we excuse you, is there any other questions you have for the commission before?
One thing that will need to be resolved at some point, and I don't know if this is the time to do it, but the retention basin, and that was brought up by the engineer on your preference on handling that, whether the city takes over ownership of that or it remains in private ownership. From our perspective, I think it makes more sense to deed that to the city and do it that way. I think that's the way it's most commonly done, but that'll be a discussion that'll need to be had at some point.
We're not the authority body for that.
No.
I think that'd probably be a city council decision there, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, and so if that's something that will need to be addressed, then that's great. There was one comment that was made by the engineer, and we probably need to get directly with him, but maybe somebody here would know it. But they would like the well protection zone noted on the plat, and that's not a public record that we have access to. I think the engineer knows what it is or whatever. We just need to know, the diameter of that well protection zone or whatnot, so we can put that.
Yeah, if you get with Matt,
And-
he can
Okay.
he can get all that to you. There are some different requirements in those well protection zones that will need to be noted for future homeowners as they build their homes and stuff. But Matt can get all that to you. So
we'll get with Matt on that. And then there was another comment made about there needs to be basically a comment on the plat about it being adjacent an agricultural area. And I didn't know if there is specific language that you wanted with that. I mean, we've used language in the past. I didn't know if there was specific language that the commission would like to see on that, as far as what's put on there. Usually it's something along the lines of, the typical sounds and smells and activities of agriculture type of stuff. But
yeah,
if there's something specific, we just would like to make sure we get it on there.
I'm actually going to be meeting with Matt tomorrow morning. I'll let him know those two things and that he can expect to be hearing from you. So,
Okay.
Perfect.
But no, that's all I had. So,
All right,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank
Any
you.
other
Yep.
Comments here?
I can't recall, is there a fencing requirement between agriculture and residential? I can't recall.
There is.
I mean, talked about.
Yes, there is.
That's what made me think of that.
The answer is yes.
That's what I thought. So, I mean, I just. make sure
And we
we're
can,
aware
I
of it.
think that's a good point for us to review when we're looking at the next round, but also for final as well. All right, thank you, Ben. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. Yep.
At this point, we can bring Dan Dixon back into the room. Welcome back, Dan. We are moving on to agenda item number 2, which is to discuss our conditional use ordinance. That's ordinance 10-26-020. And at this point, I'd like to, Will, for you going to take over this part? Okay, perfect. So we'll turn it over to Will to walk us through this portion of the agenda.
So one of the things when I came on and started working with the city that I was asked about and we talked a fair amount about was doing some review of the city's ordinances, which hadn't been updated for some time. And there've been a number of changes in state law and in practice and so on. And so to take a look at that and see what areas of the city land use codes might need to be adjusted or have some modifications made to them. So which is what I've done. And I decided probably the best thing to start with would be the conditional use permits. To be quite honest, in many zoning codes around the state, this is one chapter that's probably the most out of compliance with state code. So it's not just Morgan, it's a lot of communities. And part of the reason for that is that over the years, there have been some pretty substantial changes made at the state level on conditional uses and how they work and what they are supposed to do and not do. And quite frankly, many communities don't get around to updating their codes that frequently. Some are very diligent about it, but many just, they don't have the time, they don't have the resources, or they're maybe not even aware that they need to make some modifications or changes to their codes. So as I looked over the code in Morgan, there are some areas that need a little bit of work, the conditional use chapter being one of them. And there are some things that I think really do need to be changed to be more in compliance with what the state code requires, and to be more consistent with what that code says and what some of the court rulings have been. And then also just to make sure that it's in the good form for the current state of the practice. So what I'd like to do is maybe talk with you a little bit about some of the red flags that I've seen in the code, and then talk about those, how you'd maybe like to modify those. And then we'll go forward from there and make some changes. That may mean we just rewrite the chapter altogether, get a whole new chapter, or we just redline and make some strikeouts and additions to this one, but it kind of depends on how far we want to go. So with that, if I could, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about it. I don't know if you all have copies of the code in front of you of this section. Yeah, should be. So while she's getting those copies, maybe we can start talking about it. In that section of the code of the city code, under paragraph 10.26.020, listed as conditional use permits, under the paragraph B, where it says considerations of conditional use procedure. We may want to look at the whole procedure and being a little bit more specific about how to approach, but I think generally it's not in bad shape. But one of the things, and this has been very common throughout the state. I think really what happened years ago was that everybody copied each other and they had very similar language. And then as things kind of changed, some of that language didn't get changed in many of the codes. As you look a little bit further down in that paragraph, it says that the commission may deny a permit. That's really language that's problematic at this point. State code has been modified to the point where conditional uses, in the state code, it says that they shall be approved. And that there can be reasonable conditions placed on them to mitigate reasonably anticipated impacts from that conditional use. And if that can be done, then they shall be approved. This was some changes in state code, I think partly brought about by the fact that many jurisdictions were looking at the conditional uses as being completely discretionary. You could decide whether you wanted to have it or not, just kind of based on whether you thought that was a good idea or not. And that's almost kind of like when you're getting into the legislative arena of deciding whether you want to allow it or not. And so based on some court rulings and then some changes in the state code, what we advise now in most jurisdiction is you really cannot deny a conditional use permit, at least not very easily. You have to have some pretty substantial reasoning and evidence and background in order to deny it. So we could leave the language about denying it and putting the additional language in there that says if the conditions cannot be, it's like in the state code, if the conditions cannot be imposed that mitigate the reasonably anticipated effects. So that's one possibility. Most jurisdictions just take that deny out. And they just say the language about that the permit shall be approved with potentially with conditions that would mitigate any reasonably anticipated impacts. So that's probably an area that we need to make some modifications on and take that language out. Would probably take that whole paragraph and kind of rewrite it a little bit so it's more consistent with the state code. But I just want to make sure that you all understand that conditional uses really are not very discretionary. If you've got it listed in your code as a conditional use, what you've really decided is that it's okay in that zone. There may be some things that are associated with it that may need some conditions to be placed upon them based on the circumstances, where it's located, maybe what's next door to it and so on, that would mitigate some of the possible impacts from it. But by and large, it's permitted. And so you should consider it that way. And we'll talk about that in a minute here with relationship to your land use tables, because I think that's really a key or an important consideration to keep in mind. So that's one area. The next section, which talks about the appeal of a decision, paragraph 040, appeals of those decisions. We may just want to modify where that is or move that a little bit so that it falls more into line with the whole process. That's a fairly minor consideration. But what I wanted to raise with you is this question. In the first line of that paragraph, it says any person shall have right to appeal a decision of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission is the entity, the land use authority that makes the decision on the conditional use, whether it should be approved or with what conditions. But anyone can appeal that, and it says to the city council. There is nothing in the state code that would prevent the city council from being the appeal for conditional uses, but in practice, generally, it's not something that most land use professionals and legal professionals now would recommend. We would recommend that it go to your appeal body, as most of your other land use decisions do. And are supposed to go. This is a land use decision, very much like all of the others that you make under your zoning code. And we would recommend that the appeal go to that appeal authority. Teresa, do you have a hearing officer or do you have a board? Yeah, so you use hearing officers as your appeal authority. So that's where an appeal would go. Part of the rationale for that is, and I'll talk frankly at this point, don't generally see the city council as being a good body to do appeals, because this is an administrative process. And the city council is primarily a legislative body. They make policies and adopt the rules and regulations. They don't generally enforce them. That's left to, in land use, the land use authority, which is sometimes staff, and it's oftentimes the planning commission. And that's a role that you have and that you're used to playing. City council's not used to that. They're used to making policy decisions based on opinion and process of where the neighbors come in and say what they like and don't like, and so on and so forth. And so we oftentimes see that gets communities into trouble, because they kind of, it's hard for the city council members to take off that hat of being a legislative body and putting on the administrative one. And it's even more difficult with an appeal, because an appeal body, while it's part of the administrative process, they work by another different set of rules, which we call the quasi-judicial. It's almost like being in a court, and you use that set of rules. And again, I'll tell you honestly, city councils aren't very good at that. They're good at the other part of what they do, which is their great role. But we really would recommend that be the appeals go to the appeal authority. As I said, though, initially, there is nothing in the state code, though, that would prevent a city council from acting as an appeal body. It can be done. It is done in some communities. It's not illegal, but it's not something that we as land use professionals would recommend. So, Mr. Chair, I guess maybe we got to leave that, put that to discussion with you all at this point.
Yeah, thank you for that. At this point, I guess just to clarify our process for moving forward, you've identified the potentially taking out the deny clause. In this case, the appeal authority. Are we looking at these line by line and making recommendations along the way for the city council in this meeting right now? Is that?
What I'm trying to get from you all is kind of a sense of where you want to go with this. And then I'll go back and actually draft up some recommended changes. And then we can discuss those specifically at an upcoming meeting.
So thank you. I'd love to hear from the commission. Go ahead.
Well, I guess my point, or my question is, so we're still a recommending body even after we do this, and the city council is the approving official.
No, not for a conditional use. You're the actual,
this
you're the
doc-
land use
No,
authority.
for this document.
To
Oh, you mean for
adopt the
this change of the, yes, that is
That's
correct.
Okay, that's what I wanted.
You will be recommending
Right.
changes to the city council, and it'll be up to the city
That was
council.
my understanding. I just wanted to
Yes,
put
yes,
that-
I'm sorry.
okay.
Yes, you're correct.
From that standpoint, let's discuss it. Makes sense to me. It's if it's antiquated and it doesn't feel like it's consistent with the direction of some of the more modern practices and codes that other jurisdictions might be moving forward with. It feels like it's a great time for us to do exactly some of these things. I am not opposed at all to not using the city council as the appeal authority. I think that's smart. So.
No, I think this is a great thing to look at. I mean, I don't even think we need to go through it line by line. I think it'd be great to draw on your knowledge of this and have you go through and at the bare minimum, bring us up to where we're consistent with state codes, bare minimum. And if there's other things that in your opinion or from your viewpoint, your experience that need to be looked at in addition to just getting us up to speed with state codes. And I may think maybe we do another list of that and maybe there's a little more discussion, but at least get us up to par with, state requirements and codes. I think that's a great thing to look at.
And I had a similar question. Thank you, Lance. I appreciate that. With respect to, there might be some red flags, but then there might be some things that are actually in conflict with the state code.
Right.
And so there's different levels of, these have to change because they're not legal. These should change because they're not best practices. And these we could change because it fits the culture of our community or what have you. So
Right.
it might be helpful to understand the nature of
Is
the
which-
recommendation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think to that comment, the first one where it talks about denying the planning commission being able to deny. I mean, you can deny, but you have to have some really good substantial reasons as to why it cannot be mitigated. And so I think we can put the language in there. There's another reference to that or a similar kind of language in paragraph 70, where it talks about the planning commission shall not authorize a conditional use permit unless evidence is presented. And I think you really kind of just flip that around and say that the planning commission shall approve a conditional use permit with conditions to mitigate reasonably anticipated impacts, and only that it would be denied if that can't be done. And so I'm saying that language really should be kind of modified to be more consistent with what state code is now. And so that would be in that realm. This part about whether the city council is the appeal body, it's not prohibited by state code, but it's something that land use professionals and legal professionals generally recommend that's not best practice. It's not a good thing to do by and large, but it can be done if you locally feel like that's what you want to do.
Thank you. Other discussion on this?
Yeah, I have a question. I guess as you looked at this, Will, if you focused and narrowed in on this one specific area to start, you mentioned that there's other areas
Yeah.
that you would go after, right?
Yeah, we'll
So-
talk about some. Are you talking about just under conditional uses or other parts of the code?
Other parts of the code.
Yeah,
I'm
there's,
just thinking globally, as we look at this, how many different areas do you think there are that will require changes?
I haven't really looked over everything, but there's not a lot, but there's a few things I think where we
Talking
could
about a
do with some
dozen or
changes.
so?
What's that?
A dozen or so?
Yeah, probably.
Wilf, I think we can continue.
Okay. So with that, and you look at paragraph or the section 070, determination and considerations, I just talked about that language in there where the planning commission shall not authorize a conditional use permit. I think we just flipped that language around, saying that the planning commission shall authorize it as long as it can be shown that the anticipated impacts can be reasonably mitigated. The paragraph D in that section where it talks about conditions imposed by the planning commission shall be based upon options described in this chapter. That is a very good paragraph. And that's one we ought to keep, probably even enhance. And then you list a number of standards there. Some of those standards we may want to make a little less general and a little more specific so that it doesn't seem to kind of leave a lot of discretion. But as I noted under the standards for conditions, under the paragraph A, which is on compliance, points 8 and 9, where it talks about modification to allow population density and intensity of land use where land capability and vicinity make it appropriate to do so. That's you're starting to get into questions of opinion again, policy and opinion. Do we think like it's appropriate to have this kind of density there? There probably ought to be more solid standards there than just kind of, it almost seems like it's asking for your opinion. And that gets you into trouble in administrative areas. The state legislature a couple of years ago passed a provision that we now call the plain language provision. And what that basically says is if there's an area in your code which seems to be kind of discretionary and a reasonable person can look at it and interpret it in different ways. And basically what it means is if the city wants to interpret it this way and the property owner or the applicant wants to interpret it a different way, and somebody can look at those, both proposals or both of those ideas and say, well, under the language you've got in your code, I could see how you could do it either way. Then under that plain language provision in the state code now, it says basically tie goes to the runner, which means the property owner prevails. And so what that really tells us is that be very clear about what you want to regulate and how you're going to regulate it. And so leaving questions that are more discretionary may not be the best way to go, because if it comes into dispute, you're not going to prevail. And so that point 8 and point 9 also is another one, which I think probably need a little bit more definition. And so we'll look at that and we can talk about that in a little bit more detail as we get to that point. Just so that and I'll look through some of the others, but we can discuss those in a little bit more detail. And it may be that we may not even want to have those in the code at all, if or just establish them outright. Do something very clearly to say, this is the case. If this is this, then this is what should happen. So we can take a look at that and have some discussion about that as we start drafting and getting into that. And I'll note that as we get. I'm just trying to point out some things that we need to address and get some feeling from you as to the direction that you'd like to go. So that's just a point to make on that. The other point I would like to make with you and talk a little bit with you about is not what's in this chapter, but what's in the land use tables, which is in 1016. Is that's where the land use regulations are, I believe. In 1016, and as you get down to the land use tables, which are in the paragraph starting 150. 1016 150 is residential, and then you get into commercial. When you look at those land use tables, it tells you whether things are permitted or conditional or not permitted within the various zones, and it lists a whole bunch of different kinds of uses. when I look through your table, you do have a lot of conditional uses. That really is something that I think you need to think about. As I talked about right at the very beginning, you really need to consider that conditional uses are permitted uses. And that the only thing that you're really going to do is try to determine if you need to impose some reasonable standards, some reasonable conditions to mitigate the anticipated impacts. And the impacts that you're going to mitigate, they have to be things that you have standards for in your code. So it's not like you can look at it and say, well, you know, this one, I mean, gee, yeah, you ought to do something about this because that's where the deer come down from the mountain every year and during the winter and they come, you know, someplace to go feed. Well, if that's not a standard that's in your code, you really can't address it. You have to have it listed in your code. And so when you look at all of the various uses that you've got listed here as being conditional, have you really addressed all of the standards that you would need to address to deal with the kinds of anticipated impacts that you may have for all those different kinds of uses? And so it may just make more sense to decide, let's just make them permitted or not allow them at all. Another option would be to allow them as permitted or even conditional, but actually list some standards that they have to meet. And you've done that in your conditional use chapter. You have listed some specific uses and you've put conditions with it, which it's got to be a fairly recent amendment to your code because I haven't seen a lot of communities that have done that until fairly recently, but that's a good thing. That's really what you should look at doing, is to set some specific standards for the different kinds of uses that you've got. But you've done it for a few, but you've got a lot of conditional uses in your land use table.
So are we looking to find standards for different uses and or mitigation for the nuisances? So is there some type of standard that's out there where there's a list of, you know, noise, pollution, you know, traffic, safety, different things that could potentially be an issue with a particular land use, and then
Or a
those
lot of
standards are
land
built.
uses.
So there is there something like that you're recommending, or
Yeah, and actually you do have a part in your conditional use chapter here, which does list some standards that apply to all conditional uses. And that's good. You know, we'll want to look that over a little bit and make sure that we've addressed all of the things and that they're specific enough, which we can do. And that relates to what I just started talking about, which is the standards for the conditions, that paragraph 80 in 1026. Those are good. We can just review those and make sure that they're specific enough. As I noted in that part A of that, 8 and 9 are probably not specific enough. They're pretty general. And we'll probably ought to look at some of the other standards in there and see if that's the case. But those apply to all of your conditional uses, and that's great. And we can continue to do that. Then under part 90, 1026-90, you have some conditions that relate to some specific kinds of uses. And you list them there. You know, the wireless telecommunications, the roof-mounted antennas, you've got several others, which is great. You've identified some specific things to those uses that you think may need to be addressed. And you may, if you're gonna, we ought to review all of the conditional uses that you've got in your land use tables and see if there are other things like that that need some more specific conditions. Or you may just want to consider making them permitted and forget about it, or take them out of the table as permitted altogether.
what's the trend? Is it to, rather than specifying all the uses that are conditional, to move more towards everything's permitted, and then we'll mitigate nuisances, or there's or we're explicitly going to call out that these are not permitted at all.
Right. That's really more of what we're seeing. And in some of those cases, like you say, yeah, but in some of those cases, we want to make sure that they do this and this and this. And what I'm seeing is that in ordinances that are happening now is they list them as permitted uses, but they say they have to meet these conditions. They're permitted, and have to meet these conditions. And so, then it's just a matter of the staff reviewing them and saying, does it meet those conditions? If it does, bingo, they're good to go and they can go ahead and establish themselves. Some of those things may be that you want to review. Maybe it depends on what they're next door to. If they're next door to another business, no big deal. But if it's next door to a residence, then there are some other things we want to do. And that's where your general standards may be much more useful. So we ought to, maybe I ought to give you some homework. Go take a look at your land use tables and all of the uses that you've listed in there as conditional and kind of decide, well, is it okay if we just make it permitted? And if so, let's just call it permitted. And if I do have it permitted, is there something that I think every one of them ought to meet, a standard or a requirement that they ought to meet? And then maybe we would just include that in there as being in there as a permitted use. And some of them, if you just think, I could only see that going in there if they did a whole bunch of different things. And maybe it's just best that they not go in that zone at all and just take them out. So maybe that's your assignment, is to go take a look at that list of land uses in your tables and decide what can we do with these conditional uses that are listed there? How many of them can we just make permitted? How many of them maybe we shouldn't allow at all? And which ones should we keep as conditional, and maybe list some specific standards that they need to meet before we would approve them with conditions for that.
I like that. Teresa, can we make that a action item that maybe 2 weeks before the next meeting, when you send the agenda out, that we follow up and hold ourselves accountable to that?
Did you want it on that February meeting?
Sorry.
Do you want February meeting then? Okay. And then, Mr. Chair, just to let you know how staff does permitted use applications. So what we have is we do have a permitted use application. It's no cost to the applicant, obviously, because it's permitted, but what we do in that, it basically asks just basic information, the name, the location. We also ask for a description of what they're doing, so we know that what they're actually doing is a permitted use. It also has on there that we ask for a site plan so we can see how it's laid out. We asked the other uses in the building just because we want to make sure it's compatible as well as permitted. Because sometimes we have two permitted use, but they're not compatible to be in the same building. And then it's reviewed by planning staff, the inspector, and the fire marshal, just to make sure it's in compliance with safety and if it needs a building permit, et cetera. So we've put those standards on there. So we do review those. And then that way, if we end up having a complaint, we can go back to that permitted use and say, hey, you're not doing the business that you applied for. It helps us with some, code enforcement kind of things.
Thank you. Wilf, what else? Is there anything specific that beyond what you've shared already that you want us to dig into?
I think that's mainly it. It's a long list. So that may take you a little while to work your way through it and decide whether you think that's appropriate or not to be in that zone. So, that might be a good thing to take a little bit of time on, and then we can discuss it maybe at the next meeting, how we might want to modify that list. I'll go back and draft some things up, some proposals here about how to change some of the language in the main part of the code, and have you review that. And then we can decide what to move forward with on just the procedure, the process for doing conditional uses. And then we can discuss what you think about the list of conditional uses, which ones are good to keep and which ones not.
Perfect. I think that's great. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your consultation, expertise, preparation with us. That's very helpful. And I think it can tighten up these ordinances as we consider these recommendations and pass them on to the city council. Thank you for that. Anything else before we move to the next agenda item?
No, I think that's it on that one.
All right. Thank you. Well, appreciate that. Our final agenda item for the day is the nomination of the chair and vice chair for this body. Typically, according to our bylaws, we would do this annually and we would do it in July. We have not been doing this annually and not doing it in July. We want to get on that schedule, but because we haven't done it, we're going to do it tonight and then get back on schedule with the bylaws so that every July this is happening. So you have your booklets. You can see the duties of the chair, duties of the vice chair outlined in the booklet. And we have 6 potential candidates on the commission today. Let me just read the language as it says. The commission at its first regular meeting in July of each year, so we're going to do that today, shall elect the chair and vice chair from the duly appointed members of the commission by a majority of the total membership. So it has to be a member of the commission already. The chair and vice chair may be elected to subsequent terms, and then it outlines the duties of the chair and vice chair and so on. So at this moment, I'll entertain nominations. We'll take chair first. Nominations for chair for this next period until July, when we'll vote again and get back on cycle. So
I nominate Jim Brown for chair.
and Jim, do you accept the nomination?
You should have asked me that before. I was for 4 more years. Sure, I'll accept it, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Any other nominations?
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
I nominate Nathan McClellan to continue as chair. Willing?
I accept. Other nominations? All right, we will do, go ahead.
I'll move the proposal nomination.
Thank you. Motion accepted. Just trying to make sure we do this right here. Let's vote by majority. We'll vote in the order that the nominations occurred. And after we vote in the new chair, we'll accept nominations for vice chair. So all those in favor of Jim Brown as chair, please vote. Let's say I didn't see everyone's hand. So we got 1, 2.
Flip the coin.
Okay, so that's 2 votes. That's not a majority yet.
There was 3.
Did you? I didn't see your hand.
Wes,
Okay,
Lance, and myself.
okay. So 3 votes.
That's what I
I
said.
saw a good way to get us to a push.
We're gonna
That's-
flip the coin.
we may need to. All right. All in favor
Just a
of,
second.
yeah.
Is that correct? Am I? Yes. Okay.
okay. Everything good? All right. All in favor of voting Nathan McClellan as the chair for the next period, indicate. So, well, it doesn't say anything for a tie that I know of. We may have to defer to our experts here online. Will, Steve, help us out here. What do we do?
I'm going to throw this one to Steve.
Oh, yeah, this is, there's not a provision for it in your bylaws. And so I would say that basically what happens at this point in time is you go forward as is until the issue is brought back before the commission. If the commission can't make a decision, then the status quo is maintained and you just go forward and put the item on the agenda for another time.
And is that partially because we have an even number on the commission voting right now? And
Correct.
maybe next month we'll have 7 people. And so someone would get a majority in that case. Is that?
Yeah. And you just have to make sure they didn't abstain.
Hey, Steve, when oftentimes in just a regular election cycles, there's a tie. I've seen where a judge is maybe arbitrarily or, under his direction, basically flipped a coin, draw straws or whatever. Are those options?
Sure. But in this situation where we actually have the opportunity to have a full commission with the 7 members, then it could be taken care of. It could be taken care of that way. And so again, if it's a tie vote, that means that no action is taken. And so it's just continued to a next agenda.
It just defer it till the 7 are there.
Correct.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Not being much of a gambler myself, that'd be the way I would go.
All right.
I like the idea of rock, paper, scissors personally, but I don't think it's going to come down to that. So.
I've seen coin
the
tosses.
reality, it's been, I've done this for a couple of cycles at this point and am happy to continue to serve. I'm also happy to allow others that opportunity. So, we can put it before the vote when we have a full commission present and see if we can break the tie. Should we hold off then on the vice chair vote too, because that could impact the nominations?
That would be my recommendation. Yes.
Okay. Let's do that. Let's. Well, we'll do it in July for sure this time around, but.
Is it a bad sign that we can't come to a decision?
No, it's a sign that you've only got 6 there. That's why you've got the 7th.
So at this point, then I don't know if we need a motion to put that back on the agenda, or just that's the outcome of the vote. And because we're at an impasse, we'll put this back on the agenda when we have a full commission and can therefore get a majority vote one way or another. So let's do that.
That's the default, correct?
Okay, sounds good. I think that covers it. That takes us through our 3 agenda items. Before the recording stopped or after?
So, having heard that, Mr. Chair, I move that we close the meeting.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you, Jim.
Steve, we were just going to talk about our mandatory training that's going to happen next week. And then a training opportunity that Wolf's going to talk about through the Land Use Authority. So unless you want to stay on, you want to stay on?
I have another meeting, so I'll go ahead and take off.
All right.
Thanks, folks.
Later.
All right.
Thanks.
Uh-huh.